Hello and welcome everyone to our summit session on trends and breakthroughs in civility and civility at work. My name is Rick Oslin. I will be facilitating the session. I'm a senior consultant with the NeuroLeadership Institute, and I'm joined by some wonderful colleagues who have done amazing work in this area. And I would like to give them an opportunity to introduce themselves to you now, and we'll be hearing more from them during the session. So I'd like to start with Suzanne. Suzanne, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Yes. Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm Susanna Baker. I'm a research associate professor at NYU's Department of Psychology, and my work focuses on trying to bring neuroscience out of the lab into real-world situations and understand better how our brains
All right. Hello and welcome everyone to our summit session on trends and breakthroughs in civility and civility at work. My name is Rick Oslin. I will be facilitating the session. I'm a senior consultant with the NeuroLeadership Institute, and I'm joined by some wonderful colleagues who have done amazing work in this area. And I would like to give them an opportunity to introduce themselves to you now, and we'll be hearing more from them during the session. So I'd like to start with Suzanne. Suzanne, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Yes. Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm Susanna Baker. I'm a research associate professor at NYU's Department of Psychology, and my work focuses on trying to bring neuroscience out of the lab into real-world situations and understand better how our brains support everyday dynamic social interactions. I'm very happy to talk about civility today.
We're happy to have you with us. Thanks, Suzanne. And Sebastian, if you would share a little bit about yourself.
Trying to get the color grading right. Hi, my name is Sebastian Schorsch. I'm an associate professor at the School of Management at the University of the Andes in Bogota, Colombia. And I'm heavily involved in behavioral and leadership education at that university for undergrads, graduates, and in executive programs. And my research focuses on pro-social behaviors such as civility and on relational networks and organizations. I'm happy to be here and happy to share the state of affairs with you.
Thank you, Sebastian. Wonderful. And Bridget, if you would share a little bit about yourself.
Sure thing. I'm really excited to be here today. I'm Bridget Lynn, based in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I'm the Director of Research Design on NLI's research team. I have a PhD in psychology in the public interest and have applied research in a variety of settings and industries for over a decade, enabling science-based success. I like doing the work I do because I get to influence the workplace, which for many people is a defining environment in our lives. We spend so much time at work, and how that time is spent influences us and those around us. So I'm so excited to talk about civility at work and excited for this conversation.
Thank you so much. And so we're excited to have all three of you with us to share your research and to share your thinking on our topic, which is, again, civility at work. What we're going to do is I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction. We'll get some operational definitions in place. What do we mean by civility? What is incivility? And then we're going to get into the research of each of our speakers. We'll start with Suzanne's work in the area of neurosynchrony and its applications to civility. We'll then engage Sebastian in work that he's done around the impact, pro-social behavior, but the impact that civility has on the workplace and that it has on all of us. And then finally, Bridget is going to share the NeuroLeadership Institute's work on civility and our approach to increasing civility in the workplace. All right. So I think we all know why we're here. If you joined this session, we've all been experiencing, I think, an alarming trend, whether politically, socially, in the workplace, around civility. And because of that, even though it is alarming and disappointing, it is certainly a topic that warrants our attention. I want to start first by identifying what do we mean, or what is sort of our operational definition of incivility. And typically what we mean by incivility is something that actually is relatively ambiguous. Incivility at times can be intentional or unintentional. It can be obvious or at times quite subtle, picked up by some but not by others. What we do know is that when people feel that like they've been treated in an incivil way, they experience certain kinds of behaviors, some of them more overt and extreme. Overt rude behavior, very obviously ignoring somebody's point of view, maybe an emotional attack or outburst in the context of something you've said or done. Something that we can tell pretty obviously is mean-spirited, rude, or nasty. But many of us also experience incivility in more subtle ways, right? At times, an interruption is hard to tell whether or not that was done intentionally to cut us off, whether it was done out of enthusiasm for somebody else who had a point of view, whether a tone of voice was meant to be condescending or not. In other words, there are a number of things that can trigger our sense of feeling like we've been treated in a disrespectful or incivil way, not necessarily intended. So there's some subtlety here. What we do know is if we feel that it does have a significant impact on us, that those who feel that they operate in an environment that is uncivil or incivil, actually both terms work, don't show up for work as much. Their performance declines. Their sense of commitment to their work and those around them declines. And this notion of worrying becomes a part of the environment that they feel they are a part of. The other thing that's fascinating is that of people that were asked in this research, many of them said that now, whether with their colleagues or with customers that they interface with, incivility has become something that they actually expect as part of their daily work and interactions. So now I'd like to flip things over to, so then what is meant by civility? What are we talking about if we want to build more civility within our world and our workplace? What we're talking about is a set of behaviors that we're going to associate with sort of fundamental politeness or regard for others. It's a sense that you are preserving some sort of foundational level of respect for other human beings. So civility often gets associated, and rightly so, with these foundational kind of social norms or common norms around what we would call manners, being courteous, being polite to each other. And the last bullet is probably the most critical when it comes to kind of understanding what we might draw as a distinction between civility and respect. And Bridget will get into this a bit more when she shares NLI's point of view. But the distinction is fundamentally this. Civility is a general awareness that I have, that you have, about what it means to be polite or courteous. Whereas we'll talk a bit more about respect being more individualized, a genuine sort of individualized concern, awareness, curiosity for other human beings. So we'll draw those distinctions more here in a bit. But what I'd like to do now is stop talking myself and hand things over to the people that are the experts. And so I'd like to start with Suzanne and Suzanne's work in neurosynchrony. And I think at this point, what I'll ask you to do is I'm going to stop sharing screen and allow Suzanne to share screen and share her research and her thoughts with us. Oh, and I think you're on mute, Suzanne.
Are you seeing the right screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So thank you for that introduction. So my work is really around how our brains and bodies synchronize to the world around us and to each other. And so as I'm sure you all feel, maybe not daily, but at least have at some point in your life, is that your brain and your body likes to track the rhythms of the world around you, right? Like you probably like listening to music and you like moving to music. And this gives you a sense of pleasure and a sense of connectedness to what you're engaging with. And if we dance in groups, and if you have dancing groups in your life, which I am going to assume that you probably have, you will also have found that your brains and bodies really like tracking the rhythms of the people around you. And so music as an external source of rhythm might, make you, put you in that position to share your rhythms with others. And so what my work is really focused on is the question of whether the extent to which the rhythms of our brains and our bodies are synchronized with each other, if that relates to our everyday experiences of social connectedness. So to translate this in very basic question terms, is if we're really in sync with each other, does that lead to good rapport or civil behavior? And is the opposite maybe true if we are not in sync with each other, right? And this can be a bidirectional relationship. And so I've asked this kind of question in several different settings and scenarios, ranging from parent-child interactions to educational settings, looking at people with social developmental disorders or challenges in museum settings, looking at therapy. And this is not just my research. In the past decade or so, there's been an increase in research focusing on the relationship between the synchrony between our brains and bodies and our feelings of connectedness and social rapport. And the way that I engage communities outside of laboratories, so traditionally we shove people's heads into MRI machines at the university, but this kind of work obviously requires people to be more in their everyday interactions, is I built installations or experiences that directly show people how in sync their brains and bodies are. So an example would be the compatibility racer, where we measure brain activity of multiple people and then translate their synchrony into the motor speed of a card that goes faster as synchrony increases, and it slows down as synchrony decreases. And so here you can see people trying to move the card through conversation, but you can imagine that you might be inspired to try out all sorts of different strategies to make the card move through synchrony. And think then also yourself about what might make your brain sync, what might make your body sync. When do you feel most connected to people around you? Right. And so we've done this in various different settings. And so these are just some examples of installations that we've done with populations of different ages. And we've also worked with schools. So here's a video of a collaboration that we did with a high school in New York City. And we've done this in multiple high schools across the city and in other places as well, where we really work with the teachers and the students to, include them as part of the research process and ask questions around how the extent to which their brains synchronize during their regular everyday activities in the class relate to their learning and their social closeness. And so this work and the work of others and the work in our other settings together have kind of started painting a picture of some factors that seem to be impacting synchrony. So we know that how engaged you are or how interested you are impacts how synchronized you are with the people around you. We know that how much you like your teacher or your boss, or the person that you're interacting with directly, that impacts how synchronized you are when they're telling you a story. So then we know how focused you are. So that is slightly different, like in that today you might be really tired and not so engaged or not so focused on my speech, for example, and then you might be less in sync with the people around you. You might also be distracted by other things that are happening on your screen that prohibit you from synchronizing with what's going on. We know that how close you feel to others impacts synchrony. And that doesn't mean that you have to know each other for a very long time. If you have an initial gut feeling about how much you like each other, the other person, that actually impacts your synchrony with the person around you. And personality traits, right? So we see that people who really like being in groups, they actually synchronize more with the people around them if they're in a group settings than people who enjoy being alone. And then all of these factors, so as I said, it's like the chicken and egg question depends on the study, but we do also see that it impacts some critical, output measures like how well you perform or learn and the social report that you feel. So just to throw on a couple of science results from our lab. So here's a study led by Ido Davidesco that showed that when that the extent to which the brain synchronize of people that are trying to learn something and remember something actually predict how well they remember something later. So you can look at brain activity of groups of people and then say, hey, this is an item that I learned. Were they actually more synchronized when they were provided with this information? We see that there's a relationship with body sway synchrony. So like if you have teachers and learners, or that could be, in a work setting as well, right? Like you're engaging with somebody who's in your team, how locked in your movements are with each other actually predicts how much and how well you learn, and the way that and your strategy of interacting with the other person impacts your synchrony, which impacts your learning and understanding and mutual rapport. And then we see that when we look at team performance on different kinds of tasks in this study led by Diego Reinero, we see that interbrain synchrony actually is a better predictor sometimes, not always, but sometimes, of how people might self-report on their performance in specific settings. And now what can you do to boost synchrony, right? So there are one thing that we did with large numbers, thousands of participants have engaged with our installations. And so one thing we asked them is what is the strategy that you use to synchronize with the person in front of you? And some of them engaged in joint action, which you just saw, like moving together, that boosted synchrony over time. Having eye contact boosts synchrony over time. And also, and not so much in this particular measure, but we know from other measures that it does. If you have to share a shared common ground, or then that also increases synchrony. The details as to why it doesn't in our case has to do with the measurement that we're using. Okay, so I wanted to put our colleague panelists on the spot. And so I actually do not see the chat, I think, but if I wanted to know if it's somebody's birthday today in the group, in the audience. I can't see it though.
I
As
will
I'm
be looking
sharing.
for, I'll be your eyes.
Okay.
I
Do you
don't.
have a name of somebody's birthday today?
Um,
This week or this month? Coming up.
I'm hesitating. Yeah, I had one this last month, but does that mean I don't have to sing? So
No, it
way.
does not. You say
You're not getting it.
yourself. Okay. All right. Is that it? So let's do it. Right. Or do we have somebody in the group?
It doesn't look like
not yet. No.
nobody's
Okay.
admitting
Just
to
now.
it.
Yeah.
All right. So let's sing then. Happy birthday to you. Sebastian, you have to unmute, otherwise we will not hear you. All right. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Happy
Happy
birthday
to
to you.
me.
Happy
Happy
birthday
birthday to you.
Happy birthday,
Happy
dear Rick.
birthday.
Okay, we can stop.
Thank
I
goodness.
think the
Thank
picture,
goodness.
I think we all got the picture. We all know about Zoom fatigue, right? Like this is a phenomenon that we're all very familiar with. And one thing that happens, and I was really surprised because even after years of doing online things, I find that people sometimes are still surprised with the fact that if you start singing or doing something rhythmic, this causes a full-fledged chaotic breakdown, really, in your interactions, right? And so what's happening? So I know that I wanted to take 30 more seconds, if that's okay. With this. So I know the singing took longer than I was anticipating it. I'm sorry, I didn't factor that in. So what's happening is that when you're interacting face to face, is that we're all locked into the rhythms of the people around us, and this is actually something that gets disrupted when you're interacting online. And so if we go back to what Rick was saying earlier, like when might we feel like we've been treated uncivil? There's actually really important rules that are subconscious about how we actually experience people around us, and being incivil. And so we might feel like somebody's interrupting or not listening, even though that's not actually the case of what is happening in the room, right? In a social room. Another thing that happened was that I feel closer to you. So like doing something like this is a bonding experience, right? And this is something that we really see in the classroom as well. So if we put students, we put them face to face and have like an awkward interaction, an eye contact interaction with each other for just 2 minutes before starting the class, we actually see that the people it's not just that people are sitting next to each other or more in sync that people that are not sitting next to each other. We see that this engagement, this like eye contact or just saying like, hey, I'm here, you're here, actually helps you synchronize later on in whatever you're doing with the people around you, right? So this water cooler effect. And we see that this is, helpful for people who've known each other for a very long time. So it doesn't matter if you are just new to each other. This has to be re-upped and rekindled every now and then. So the bottom line being that in-person and online interactions are critically different. And we might not always be aware of how they are different. And that might be part of what we might want to be working on, is making sure that we're all aware of these differences. Thank you so much. I'll stop sharing now.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks so much. I am going to pull. I realize I needed to move my slides forward, so I'm going to have to do some catching up here to get to where we need to be. I'm so sorry, everyone. But I wanted to, if we could, take a moment as a group and I see a number of questions popping up in the chat, and we want to get to those questions. We're going to have some time at the end of our session today to dig into some of them. I think that the thing that Suzanne, that you called out at the end that was super interesting is, again, what are the implications that synchrony has for civility? And how does this even translate to, again, in-person interactions versus online interactions, maybe even the impacts that we've experienced through working from home during our COVID years, and how those may have somehow directly or indirectly impacted civility as well. The question I'd love for you to share your thoughts on in the chat, for all of you, if you would take a moment, based on what Suzanne shared with us, what are some of the connections that you're drawing about building synchrony and civility? and even some thoughts about applying this to your own work. I saw comments around, does this apply to coaching, to in-group coaching? So what are the different areas that you might be able to apply this? Emotional intelligence and civility, being self-aware first, absolutely. Marcia, I'm looking at your comment about during the pandemic teaching graduate courses online and putting students in breakout rooms, potentially again to give them that small group interaction, build more synchrony between them. I heard just with a client the other day, part of a large healthcare organization, the discussion that the senior leader, the CEO, was having about the loss of actually synchrony and civility within the organization. Again, when many people were restricted in their interactions due to the COVID years. And Trina, I love your comment about it feels like it connects to our sense of belonging. And I'm wondering if that might not be a great jumping off point to introduce the work of Sebastian. And so Sebastian, I'd love to have you jump on off of mute and share your thoughts as well. And I'll invite you, just you can tell me when you'd like me to move the slides.
Okay, let me check. No, I have no possibility of moving them. Perfect. Yeah. Then hello from my side. I'm glad to be here to maybe serve a bit as a reminder for those that get frustrated by the incivility that they face in their environments, that civility has positive influences on organizations and on ourselves. Maybe you can move the slide. I would like to give you an overview, and yeah, maybe it's often important to be reminded of that since it's not so visible and we're always remembering the negative interactions at work we have, that it's worthwhile to act in a civil manner and that we're actually making a difference for our organizations, for our teams, and for our own careers. And next slide, please. And let's start with some research findings that have been replicated over and over again, and just looking at meta-analysis that compare these findings. Civility leads to organizational commitment among members of organization. That means that these individuals identify with this organization, identify with its goal, and most importantly, they wish to remain a member of these organizations. And if we think about leadership, or if we think about organizations and managers in general, that's what we want, right? We want people to collaborate with us and to solve problems with us. And so if we can make them significantly move in that direction just through civil interactions, that's actually quite powerful. So these individuals are also feeling positively about their own jobs, right? And its characteristics, raising their job satisfaction. Civility increases mental health of individuals, and there it's sometimes a bit difficult to say, okay, incivility worsens mental health, and civility improves mental health, and what is the causal factor? Like, not going in too much detail here, but there are findings that in civil environments, people are less depressed and less likely to burn out. So that's a positive effect. And civility has a notable influence on thriving at work. And thriving here means like a sense of vitality and a desire to learn in organizations, right? And then pro-social behavior, civility has also the effect of preventing some negative outcomes. So I guess that's kind of like flipping the coin here from organizational commitment, but civility lowers the intention of people to quit. It lowers the emotional exhaustion, and it lowers significantly the physical symptoms that are mostly related to stress, right? Like headaches or strain or digestion issues, sleep disturbances, and so on. So it is a powerful tool. We can go to the next slide. on the individuals, but also on their work groups. And here, just to move a bit more quickly, obviously, civility and the go back, please, Rick, to the teams. Clearly, norms of civility are very positive in work groups, and they improve the group dynamics in such that teams increase their cohesion. So basically, they build a bond, and they, most importantly, have a desire to stay with the group rather than quitting and distancing from the group, and has positive influences for the group performance. You probably all heard about the holy grail of teams research, psychological safety. So civility and civil behaviors allow psychological safety to emerge. Like, there are lots of contributing factors that are caused by these types of behavior. So we're avoiding unnecessary confrontations. We're displaying that we're open to feedback. We're respecting and we're including people, we're encouraging them to share. And overall, we're lowering the fear of everyone to express themselves. And finally, it has been found that civility is also directly linked to the creative performance of groups, because it facilitates information processing and it facilitates reflection upon behaviors and ideas in conversations, right? So this helps in a way to move the ideas forward. And if we go to the biggest aggregate, to organizations on the next slide, then basically we see that these individual level dynamics and these positive effects also translate and materialize at the organizational level. We're in organizations with lots of civil behaviors and strong civility norms have lower turnover, like have higher employee retention. In some places where that might be relevant, the workplace safety has been found to be improved. It connects people inside the organizations, right? The flow of information gets better, the exchange of ideas is improved, and ultimately leaders that act civilly also gain more trust, right? And this trust, you all know, creates employee engagement and focused, the workers being more motivated and feeling more valued. So overall, there are lots of positive effects. And the starting question is always, does it make a difference for me personally if I act civilly, or if I make an effort to be a good person in my organization? And there, what I mentioned before, we are facing so much incivility, and we often have these episodes that we see that the people that are behaving in a rude or disrespectful way in the workplace actually get ahead. They're the ones that get promoted. They're the ones that receive the better salaries. And so my research on the next slide that I conducted with colleagues was a bit about that, about demystifying this uselessness of civil behavior. And we've collected evidence here how civil behavior actually benefits people in workplaces, and the mixture between an experimental study and an empirical study in an organization, where we found that people that acted civilly were perceived as warm and competent. And the combination of both things is actually something very important that has been found in other research as well, right? These people are not just perceived as competent or not just perceived as nice, but it kind of fosters this combination of these two desirable characteristics. And as a consequence of creating these perceptions in others, these others are likely to seek out the civil person for advice, and as a consequence, also acknowledge informal leadership of this person. And ultimately, at the very end of the study, we were able to link that to performance. So the people that started acting civilly, in the end, had better work performance through these mechanisms. And I think it is very important to be aware of that one has it in one's own hands every day, how one interacts and how one exchanges with others. And I can give you some evidence and some confidence that even though sometimes we observe people that are rude and get ahead, it might be worth it. And there is evidence, and we've discovered some mechanisms on how that works, that civil behavior might actually pay off in the long run. what is also important, and this is a bit more preliminary research than the previous one on the next slide, Rick, is about how does civil behavior spread in organizations as compared to incivility. And here we, possibly most of you or many of you are aware of these theoretical considerations about incivil behavior spiraling out of control and in the end poisoning an entire organization. And we were interested in looking, well, empirically at this question. How does it really spread? Starting with this idea that came from the theory. And what we saw here was that no, it's actually civility that spreads in this way, that civility extends to third parties, right? That if you think about a dynamic of friends becoming friends, or civil people, or like a group of civil people, including other people in their civil dynamics, this was happening. And on the contrary, incivil behaviors did not spread at all, like in the way that was hypothesized. It was more that it was growing around particular individuals, either being that these individuals that were perceived to be treated incivilly increasingly perceived that or found these flaws in all their workplace interactions, or that it was really the case that this organization agreed upon bullying specific individuals or finding some type of consensus that it's okay to treat a particular person in an incivil way for whatever reason. But the important takeaway, I think, from this research, where we're still following up with some experiments, is that incivility did not spread, but civility spread. And this is another reminder why it is so important to promote these pro-social behaviors or engage oneself in these pro-social behaviors, because it is contagious to other people. So, Rick, could you move to the next slide to finally wrap this up here? You are all HR professionals or engaged in organizational design or consulting, and creating these perceptions of civility can come from a variety of places, right? We can influence factors at the level of the organization, at the work group, but also at this interpersonal level that I was emphasizing in my research, right? Like norms and policies at the organizational level certainly help. How we manage work groups, how we structure work groups certainly helps, but it is always very important to look at oneself and to look at the influence that oneself has on others, especially taking into account these contagious dynamics of pro-social behaviors. And this is where I would like to close my presentation. Thank you, Rick.
Apologies, I was talking to myself. I was still singing happy birthday to myself, actually. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I think, and I think I was tracking some of the comments in the chat. I think something certainly surprising to me, and I think to others as well, was this last piece that you shared, that civility seems to get more traction, so to speak, than incivility. And there was a comment made earlier that I'm wondering if you have any research on or a point of view on, related to also, have you noticed in your work in some of these dynamics that take place more frequently, for instance, between what we might call dominant groups and marginalized groups? So even your comment about sometimes it's sanctioned, almost incivility is sanctioned. I'm wondering, or even between cultural groups, has any of your research kind of shed light on that?
Let me think. Not really. No, like between groups, I haven't specifically looked at this, but there are like some general thoughts that come to my mind would of course be
Sure.
the natural tendency of forming identities within groups, right? Where incivility might be a natural consequence of trying to positively distinguish oneself from other groups
Yes.
that one could possibly expect. This to be a natural tendency in organizations as well between groups that one has to potentially counter, but empirically I have not worked on that.
But the logic that you shared certainly makes a lot of sense, that those groups that are in group, and certainly those in groups that have some sort of positional power, might be potentially more likely to engage in these kinds of behaviors, or the impact of them isn't powerful.
Yeah, possibly the powerful groups have even more interest to being impenetrable and making sure that everybody understands that they're not in that group.
Exactly. So if you don't mind, one final question, then I'd love for Bridget to share her work as well. But I know one thing that also came up was the notion of, this sounds a bit odd, can you be too civil? In other words, is there a downside to, I'm going to call it toxic civility, but I'd love to have you share your thinking on that.
Yeah, sure. It's like everything, I guess, in organizational research taken to the extreme, one can find negative consequences. And if there is an extremely strong civility norm in an organization and one just doesn't feel it, or one just doesn't feel that this is like a genuine way of interacting with other people, this basically turns into a customer service job, and we see the same consequences of emotional labor and burnout as a consequence of that, where our actions are not in line with what we think or feel. And so then this civil behavior, or this overly civil behavior that goes beyond what we think is sustainable, well, is taking a toll on individuals. And on the other hand, there are behaviors and interactions and processes and organizations that definitely benefit from, say, slightly confrontational or uncivil behaviors. For instance, in negotiations, like in a distributive negotiation, it's all about anchoring and playing the other person and maybe not signaling any type of willingness to collaborate, right? So a civil negotiator in that type of context is possibly less efficient or less effective. And also in knowledge creation, I guess very high levels of civility will probably exacerbate groupthink dynamics, where groups are just converging on consensus prematurely, and everybody's afraid of speaking up to not burst that civil bubble. And then instead of like avoiding unnecessary conflict, necessary conflict is also avoided and is not happening. So these groups or these social systems don't push each other sufficiently into controversy. And other points, I guess, sharing from my own experience, conflicts help us form genuine relationships. The relationships that are always just superficial and nice, they don't really grow. And possibly a very strong civility norm prevents people from building these types of relationships in organizations, and possibly also brings problems on holding each other accountable. So possibly we create an environment where everything goes. We have to be aware that going too far into the civility realm, we might have to look out for dynamics that then turn a bit negative.
Yeah, the metaphor that comes to mind for me is the pendulum swing, right? So we can swing too far out in a direction, which I think we're concerned about, that incivility has become, we're experiencing way too much of it, but we can swing out the other way and create an environment where nobody can speak up, or are afraid that somehow to speak up will be associated with incivility. So it really is our goal and our job is to figure out what that sweet spot is in the middle. Thank you so much for sharing your research, and there continue to be comments, and I want to make sure that we have a little bit of time to address some of these questions. But Brian, you gave us a perfect segue into what Bridget's going to be sharing with us with the SCARF model. For those of you who aren't familiar with the SCARF model, Bridget will be sharing a bit more about it, but how does it relate to civility, and what's NLI's approach to increasing civility? So Bridget, take it away.
All right. Thank you. This is such an interesting topic, and I'm going to jump right in so that we can hopefully get to more discussion. So civility really is difficult to get right. There's lots to think through, and at NLI, we've been doing that thinking. We're thinking about things like, how does intent versus impact play into civility? And how do we acknowledge and address our missteps? How does the current state of employees, which is overwhelmed in that capacity more often than not, play into civility? And if we're kind of all moving in a heightened sense of threat and stress, which makes us interact with the world differently, what can we do to stay civil? And why is it so effortful and hard sometimes? And so we've been doing this thinking and writing about it, and we're excited to walk you through our latest thinking. And so on the next slide, what you see is what we like to talk about is the brain's basic organizing principle. And that's the idea that human behavior is driven by trying to avoid or move away from threat and seek or move toward reward. And at work, these threats and rewards are social and based on our relationships with others, and they influence how we interact with one another. And what you see on this slide is that threat is depicted as longer because when we're presented with a potential threat, we respond more powerfully and quickly than we do to a reward. And it takes up a lot of our cognitive resources. And so I do want us to keep this principle in mind. And while we are, I want to think about our reactions to incivility will be faster and stronger than our reactions to civility. And so on the next slide here, what we're starting to think about is NLI's SCARF model. And this model helps us understand what we might experience as social threat in a work context. And we can use this model to help us better predict, regulate, and really try to figure out what's going on with social behavior. It's made up of 5 domains of interpersonal need. So that's what you see here: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And I'm going to give you a brief definition of each domain and then just follow it with what might a potential example of an incivility trigger look like for each domain. So starting with status, status is how respected and valued we feel. And an incivility threat trigger for status might be something like being talked over or constantly interrupted. Certainty is our ability to predict outcomes, and a trigger might be the use of sarcasm that leaves a person unsure of what to take away from the interaction. And then we have autonomy, and that's our sense of control. And a trigger in this area might be someone being asked for input and then having their input totally ignored. And that leaves them feeling as though they don't have any control over what gets done, whether or not they say anything. And relatedness is how connected and included we feel. And a trigger might be experiencing public shaming for being late to a meeting. Fairness is centered on equitable treatment and getting the credit we deserve. And a trigger might be someone forgetting, and that is in quotes, to share credit with a partner that co-created a product. And so let's think through how our brain reacts to these types of incivility. And so at a high level, on the next slide, what you see there is when we have a threat response to incivility, the capacity to make decisions, solve problems, and collaborate with others really is reduced. And so for the person that's exhibiting the uncivil behavior, incivility actually activates reward systems while reducing empathy, which contributes to emotional dysregulation. And for the person that's actually experiencing the uncivil behavior, incivility activates brain regions responsible for stress, like the amygdala and hypothalamus. And this impairs cognitive function in the prefrontal cortex and heightens our sensitivity to social cues. And so chronic exposure to stressful situations like incivility can actually lead to structural brain changes and an increased risk of depression and anxiety. And what we've seen in research is that even observing incivility has these similar negative effects, the same as experiencing it directly. And what we've been hearing so far in this presentation is that there's good news, right? The good news is that civility can create balance and set conditions for deeper respect, and the addition, kind of the additive piece of perspective seeking, creativity, and collaboration. And based on our research, we've developed a set of behaviors that, when shared in a group, so that's really everybody kind of sharing it together, it can interrupt the cycle of incivility that pulls people away from their work and inhibits performance. And before I go through these specific behaviors, I just want to take a moment to emphasize that incivility is embodied by a specific set of behaviors. So it's not that we can take away the behaviors of incivility and then we just have civility. It's that we need to engage in an entirely different set of behaviors to get to civility at work. And we're in the early stages of this work and starting to partner with clients and deliver briefings, but we're excited to introduce the behaviors for increasing civility at work for the first time with you all. And so what you see here are the 3 habits to grow a civil workplace. And they are: notice reactions, inhibit automatic responses, and communicate cleanly. And I'm going to talk about a little bit of the underlying neuroscience for each of these habits. And I'll start with the fact that both notice reactions and inhibit automatic responses are anchored in emotional regulation, which is basically our ability to manage our response. And emotional regulation can be made easier through a tactic called labeling. And labeling is all about identifying and naming what you're experiencing. And we can actually use the SCARF domains that we talked about in a few earlier slides to provide us with shared language that helps us label any kind of like emotions or experiences. So we can not only identify them, we can label them. And that labeling fosters emotional regulation by dampening the quick, strong response of the limbic system and really starting to re-engage the prefrontal cortex, which allows us then to be more deliberate in our responses. And this self-regulation piece really creates the base level of civility in the workplace. But it's not easy. It's effortful and it drains cognitive resources. However, I think emotional regulation is worth it. And research shows us when we are able to emotionally regulate, it has the power to help you understand the environment around you and increase your ability to think clearly. And once you're able to think clearly, it's easier to have that clean and transparent communication. And that brings us to the 3rd habit, which is communicate cleanly. And that's anchored in clarity. And clarity sends SCARF reward signals that come from shared understanding and helps keep people at a manageable threat level, which allows them to stay open to what's being communicated. And clarity is all about making sure people understand you. You can provide clarity in communication in a few different ways. And one thing is just trying to keep a neutral to positive tone so that there's no kind of negative undertone that's happening. And trying to communicate necessary information and refraining from potentially unnecessary details. So there's no feeling of like a hidden message when you're communicating. And we're not really talking about being nice or ignoring things. We're more talking about the message being communicated being easy to understand with little need for the receiver to interpret. So I'm not having to do the extra work of trying to figure out if there's anything I'm not getting from your verbal message. And these habits are all about self-awareness, emotional regulation, and really being purposeful in our responses. And they're designed to help people take the steps to get to better behavior. And it's not easy because overwork and exhaustion make it hard for people to self-regulate. makes it hard for people to make decisions and communicate and really start making sense of social cues. And so really what you see is there's a moment where a choice happens. And often the first step is trying to become more aware of that moment. And the next step is controlling that automatic response, like, okay. And finally getting deliberate with the message that we do want to communicate. And when these behaviors are practiced intentionally over time, they become shared habits that can actually be observed. And that's powerful. And so I'm going to hand it back to Rick, and hopefully we have time for some of your great questions that are coming up.
Thanks, Bridget. And yes, we do have a few minutes for a myriad of wonderful questions. So I'm feeling pressure to make sure that we get uh, um, a good variety for our panelists to respond to. I want to go back to, if it's okay, I want to go back to one quickly. And Suzanne, I think it's for you, but it's for the broader group as well. Now, one question was around, again, this notion of in the time of COVID, mask wearing became, of course, the norm, and how potentially does that impact this notion of synchrony, civility, et cetera? I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, or if the rest of the group does as well.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like, obviously you can see some very important cues in people's, lower faces that you pick up on in synchronizing with others. And we know that those are very important cues. And it depends also very much. I saw that there was another question around neurodivergent people. So like, it really highly depends also on where you're focusing. Obviously, it wasn't inclusive for people who are hard of hearing. And we also know that others weren't learning as much, like kids had a harder time learning language because they were exposed to masks. But I don't actually know of any work, I don't know, maybe Sebastian, you do, of like the incivility on the workplace effect of mask wearing in itself.
Well, I put on my slide one notion that it has been found that like civil interactions are often signaled by body language as well and by nonverbal communication, and that is clearly impeded by masks and by the virtual dimension where we just basically heads without much more means of expression. Sometimes putting up a hand, but then that's about it.
Thanks, Sebastian. And I know, and Bridget, if you want to, please jump in and speak to this as well. I know through the SCARF model, and when we talk about threat reward through those triggers, one is the element of certainty. And masking ourselves, of course, can create, I think, to your point, Sebastian, uncertainty. Our brain processes uncertainty very often as potentially a threat. When we don't know, we often assume the worst. Suzanne, did you want to add something? I saw you jumped
Yeah,
off.
I think one thing though to know, like which I think is a big contrast with what I wanted to show with the singing as opposed to just having a conversation like this, is that when people do wear masks, it's very obvious. People it can be made conscious that you're not getting some of the signals. So even if you're obviously, what you're saying is absolutely right. Like there's uncertainty that stems from this, but we are aware of the fact that it does create this level of uncertainty. And I think one of the, like, for example, beliefs, the belief system that Sebastian said, like, well, if everybody's in civil, I might, this is contagious, or like people who are not civil will be, like these kinds of, belief systems or unawareness. I wonder to what extent those are actually more prohibitive than, if you're knowing that if you're in a phone conversation, you're not getting all of the information, but they're very appropriate in certain times. And mask wearing is something that is very appropriate, I think, in certain times, right? And so I think that knowing the limitations of your mode of interaction and like fighting some misconceptions around this might be, where most of this might, where the where the money money is in solving this issue. Maybe I've learned a lot, for example, from Sebastian's talk about this that I had preconceived notions about.
Yeah, yeah, wonderful. Thank you. I know we're getting close to the end of our time, and I know also that the one question that came up consistently, or variations on it, goes back to this notion of civility being interpreted, civility and incivility being interpreted differently, just based on cultural differences, gender differences. Eden, I love your example of a very Pacific Northwest thing. But you say in the chat, I hear from East Coast folks and LA folks about that if I'm not interrupting you, then I'm not listening. So that's so that again, there are certain behaviors that are regionalized, that are cultural, that are gender-based, that can be perceived by others as disrespectful, right? Or trigger a belief in incivility. I'm sorry, it looks like I'm gonna have to stop here, but what it suggests is there's still plenty of work to do here. And I would go back to also, Bridget, what you said at the beginning, the first habit that we associate. Incivility is often a reaction. Can we temper our reactions to things that we may interpret as incivil, but I know best intent, whatever you want to use, often is the best place to start. I know we have to wrap. Thank you so much to our speakers for sharing your thoughts and your research. And I also want to give you some guidance about what's coming next, so you can all make choices that serve you well. What we have coming up next in terms of sessions is Foundations of Insight. We also have something from the lab on burnout. And finally, I will be facilitating another session, if you want me to see me sing happy birthday to myself again, on measurement and how we use measurement to facilitate change. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your thoughts and your activity in the chat. Wonderful. Thank you
So much.
Thanks, everybody.